Why is it that you think that leaders on a large scale don't listen? They don't notice their people.
Just because your boss can't email you after 5 doesn't mean that the emotional baggage that took place earlier in the day or that you carry it with you, that you don't carry it home with you. How do we set people up for success and give them the ability to do what they do best? So even if you say, look, I don't want to pulse what people are thinking on a regular basis, at least get to know them deeply on what makes them great.
This idea that people love the work, but they don't love where they're doing it. That's the breakdown. Is that what I'm hearing? My guest this episode is Jon Clifton, CEO of Gallup, world-renowned polling organization. He's got a new book out called Blind Spot, The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. This is a vital conversation for anybody who is in leadership or who wants to lead. Check it out. Well, Jon, when I got this book across my desk, I got very excited because I talk about this all the time, the lack of engagement and the lack of true leadership. And when you look at the leadership blind spot, I was like, this is the perfect title, because we could fill novel after novel after novel on leadership blind spots. But specifically, you outline the problem and the solution, and I want to start our conversation there. The way you word it is, global leaders have relied too heavily on objective information. So I want you to break that down, because this is a robust study. What is the information that leaders have kind of looked at that is objective and it's not subjective? We'll get to that momentarily. So what are they looking at? What metrics are they looking at that they shouldn't be looking at so holistically?
So for arguably the past 85 years, leaders have been obsessed with indicators like GDP. They want to know, is the economy growing or is it contracting? They're also obsessed with indicators like unemployment. The problem is that what's totally absent from this leadership dashboard is how we feel. And so if you were to pose the question to leaders, like, is the world getting sadder? Is it getting angrier? Do people feel more physical pain today than they did 15 years ago? Leaders don't know, because they don't have any way to quantify it. So this study that we started 15 years ago, where we went out into over 140 countries every single year, was to try to capture exactly that, create official statistics for how people feel.
So the solution, you say, is that leaders should closely follow well-being and happiness metrics. And I agree. And I think that Gallup is very valuable. My audience knows I'm always talking about Gallup. And I'm not sponsored, folks. I just love the data, okay? So I agree with what you're saying, but it's beyond the metrics. It's actually, okay, what do leaders need to be doing in the office, in the hallways, to be able to respond to these well-being metrics that we're going to unpack? What does that posture need to look like for a leader now knowing what you just said?
One word: listening.
Yes.
We have right now so many challenges facing the world: war, global hunger crisis, inflation. But I think the world is also suffering from another deficit, which is leaders who listen. And you can see it very clearly in any kind of data that you use, especially in workplaces, for example. There are just large percentages of people who don't feel connected to their organizations because they're not only just not getting negative feedback, they're getting no feedback at all, and they feel ignored. This is a massive problem, and leaders need to listen more.
Okay, before I go forward, I want to stay here. Just curious, from your observation and all of the data, why is it that you think that leaders on a large scale don't listen? They don't notice their people. Is it because they weren't trained? Is it because they didn't see it modeled? It's stunning to me with all the leadership books and the leadership training and everything that's out there, and yet we still see this as a pervasive problem. Do you have any sense on why that is? It's not a natural reaction for a leader to listen well?
Well, I think there are some leaders, like within meetings, and they do listen well. They ask hard questions. I think one of the challenges is listening at scale. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we've seen this huge movement in the workplace around stakeholder capitalism. And when it comes to stakeholder capitalism, many of these investors or leaders are saying, let's publish data, not just on the traditional economic indicators, but also on how our employees are doing, how our customers are doing, our suppliers, and our community. And then they create statistics for what they think is how they feel. And largely those programs are just run very poorly. because there's a science to doing listening at scale. And you can see it in their sustainability and ESG reports that they're falling short of how to do this exactly right.
Okay, that's a mouthful. So let's try to simplify that. It's really incredible, and it's right. But again, if I'm a small business leader and I'm listening to this, scale is still important to you if you have 30 employees. So what are some practical things leaders can do to begin to scale that listening?
Well, I think one is asking the right questions first and doing them in surveys. That's really the ultimate way to listen at scale. And again, it touches on asking the right questions. So Gallup has worked on this so extensively that the questions that we figured out in order to drive workplace well-being, in order to discover exactly what the right items were, we literally even followed people around with test tubes and had them spit in those test tubes. I know it sounds like a disturbing study. So we could test their cortisol levels.
Right.
And the reason that we were doing that is to say, what are the things that leaders need to do in order to make sure that there's not debilitating stress that exists in a workplace? And so a few of the things that we discovered, this is foundational, is do people know what's expected of them at work?
Yeah.
Now, this seems like the most foundational thing that could ever exist in a workplace. Well, if it was, why is it that half of workers everywhere don't actually, they say they can't strongly agree with that particular item? Why? They don't know what they're supposed to be doing.
That's right.
That is a simple conversation. That is a simple question to even ask somebody in a workplace on, do they know what's fully expected of them? So those are kind of the foundational elements about what it means to listen, whether or not somebody does know what they're supposed to be doing, and then having that ongoing dialogue about what does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. I got to test something. And John, I want you to be really gut level honest here if you think this is too simplistic. But one of the things I say on the show all the time, I get calls from leaders who are, or prospective leaders, right? Because you know the world, right? Like when we get promoted, unfortunately, our culture promotes you into leadership, whether you're good at it, whether you enjoy it, it's just like, well, we're going to promote you to a leadership role. So I get a lot of insecurity around, am I ready to lead? And what I say to these people, and I just want to know if it squares. I say, look, you can be a good leader if you just ask 2 questions on a weekly basis. The first one is, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. That's not a greeting in the hallway. How you doing? It's, hey, how are you doing? And you're getting very personal to them. You know what's going on in their life enough to be able to say, how's your kid doing? I heard he broke his ankle, or whatever it is. That's a relational question. The second question is, how can I help you win in your role? I think those 2 simple questions, and I've tried to simplify it, would allow leaders to be able to begin to build relationship, which then leads to trust. Because I would posit that most people won't answer that second question until you've asked them the first question. I think people are afraid to say, I actually need help here. But they're afraid to share that maybe they're not doing well or maybe they lose their job. What do you say to all that? Tear it apart? Endorse it? I don't care. Be honest.
I might flip the order of them.
All
and
right.
The reason I say that is that sometimes we make recommendations to leaders and managers about they need to care more about the individuals on their team, ask them about their birthdays or their families. And some of the times we create too robotic of dialogue and it feels forced. And the people that are engaging in that dialogue can feel it. But the one thing is that anytime you join an organization, whether this is a hospital, whether this is a government agency, and you're working with a team, everybody has joined because they have a shared mission. And so whether or not you're the manager, whether or not you're one of the key players, it doesn't matter where you are. Everybody's trying to achieve that mission so they can feel the sincerity when it comes to how can I help you win? And that's where I think the conversations can start, because then they'll truly feel cared about as an individual, because they can see, look, you and I need to collaborate on this in order to achieve our mission or our objective even faster.
Okay. All right. I'm okay with that. But I would also say that you can ask those personal questions without being a robot, but you got to actually know what's going on in their life.
Without question. And in fact, as you know, that's actually how I end the book, Blind Spot.
Absolutely.
Because I think, this dialogue, at least in the United States, for example, one of the questions that we ask when we see each other is, how are you? Mm-hmm. And, these sort of greetings are met with just kind of people saying, things are fine, everything's fine, or I'm doing great. And they're not even being as open about it. It's just sort of a greeting, not really a sincere question to understand how they're doing. So I do think that one thing the pandemic has changed is brought sincerity to that question when somebody asks it.
Yeah. Oh, good. And we're going to cover that, by the way, in just a moment, folks. So hang in there because I want to get Jon's take. And he writes about it extensively in the book on how the pandemic has changed things. But first, why I think this book is so important for leaders is because you break down so much of the subtitle, which is, of course, the global rise of unhappiness and how leaders missed it. And it really puts a responsibility on leaders to go, hey, you're leading humans. Now, there are 5 measures of well-being that you cover in the study and in the book. And so I'm just going to briefly lay these out and ask a question. So it's laid out to what makes a great life. Well, that's work well-being, financial well-being, community well-being. And just to kind of make sure you understand what that is the idea of think about your local zip code. That has a tremendous impact on your life. And so is it a healthy community? Physical well-being, and then social well-being, speaking to relationships and loneliness and such. Jon, I'm just curious. Work well-being, financial, community, physical, social. Did the data bear out that any of those 5 were more important than the other as it relates to happiness?
Absolutely. One that is critical and largely underappreciated when we're thinking about what makes a great life is your work well-being. We have this notion that when you work, that it's something that we need to do in order to get a paycheck, and that in order to thrive in life, it's our hobbies or our friends and family. That's what matters most. And it's not true. And if you think about it, it's a simple math issue. We spend anywhere between 85,000 to 110,000 hours of our life working. That's anywhere between 9 to 13 straight years of life. So if you're miserable doing whatever that activity is, it would make sense that you're going to be miserable in the rest of your life. And the idea that for some reason we can have this kind of work-life balance or compartmentalize emotionally what's happening at work and what's happening in the rest of our life is not true. And it's an underappreciation of humanity. Because just because your boss can't email you after 5 doesn't mean that the emotional baggage that took place earlier in the day or that you carry with you, that you don't carry it home with you. In fact, we asked the people who are most miserable at work, was there a time in the past 30 days where the stress of work caused you to behave badly with friends and family? And 66% of them said, yes, absolutely. And so this is why there's this underappreciation of where the workplace is really driving misery throughout humanity.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. And that's why I do the show, period. Every book, everything I do is to address this. And I think we've just largely overlooked this. And I'm just curious, before we go any further, why is the predominant worldview of work, in your view, that we just work to live? And we don't see work as an opportunity to contribute to the greater world. Where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from the fact that the workplace is so miserable. And I think most people join the workforce because they do want to serve a purpose. Right. They do want to join an organization that makes positive change. In fact, we just did a study with the Well-Being for Planet Earth. They're an organization based in Tokyo. And we asked people not whether or not they love what they do. And it was about 80% said that they do. And it's because teachers love to teach. Nurses love to help people. But the problem is, it's not because their work is what's killing them. It's their workplace that's making them miserable. Yeah. And so when we look at our data globally at workers everywhere, we find that 80% of them are not emotionally attached to their work. Right. And then 60% of that group is not engaged, and 20% are totally miserable. And that's a problem.
It is a problem. And I've always found that research to be interesting. So I don't want people to be confused by what Jon said, because there's a difference. One of the things that you've always pointed out in your study, I look at it every year, as I quote it every year. When we talk about the amount of people that are disengaged emotionally, you don't say they hate their job. There's that miserable sliver that you just mentioned. So this idea that people love the work, but they don't love where they're doing it, that's the breakdown. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's right. And the breakdown actually has oftentimes a single source, your boss.
Right.
And it's not always the boss's fault, because The boss is typically trained in terms of the technical expertise in order to know what they need to do at their particular job. But what they have not been trained in are the technical aspects of human management. And this is what causes so much misery throughout the workplace.
Okay, I wanted to test another thought that, again, I got from your research. I said this on the stage to 5,000 leaders a few months ago. I was revealing the data from a myriad of your work. And I said, leaders, understand something. People don't leave you necessarily because of something you did to them. It's maybe something you didn't do for them. It's not always that you did something wrong. It's just that you may not be meeting their human needs. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's a fact. One of the questions that we find that's fundamental to workplaces is whether or not people have the things and materials they need to do their jobs effectively. Mm-hmm. And we find that only 40% of workers globally say that they strongly agree to that particular item. Now, one of the things that executives, when they hear about this, they think, well, if I ask them what they need, they're going to tell me that they need a volleyball court or they need some kind of new latte machine. It's not true. Right. We went down to a manufacturing organization. We actually asked employees who said that they didn't have what they needed, what is it that you need? And they said, gloves that fit.
Wow.
It's not a money issue. You're already spending the money on the gloves, but you don't have the gloves that fit. And again, this goes back to the issue of listening, that if they were doing the proper listening at scale and then also just walking down and asking what's going on, they would have heard directly, because people are very open and candid about how they feel about things.
Yeah. So true. Jon, when I listen to somebody like you, it's so simple it makes my head hurt. That, you know what I mean? That leaders aren't grasping this stuff. Okay, I want to get your thoughts on the pandemic. You write about this in the book, so I want to just open end, let you just kind of summarize a bit of what you write about in the book on how pandemic shaped happiness. And then I want to ask you some follow-ups on the world of work based on what maybe the pandemic brought in. So what say you?
Well, I think the big thing about the pandemic is that a lot of organizations are looking to the pandemic saying it's causing burnout. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. It's not true. We did a massive study here in the United States on burnout, where we asked employees on whether or not they experienced some or a lot of burnout. And the exact same percent of people that told us that they were experiencing it before the pandemic are now saying it today.
That's right.
Which means that there was no change before the pandemic and today. Now the conversation has changed, but to say that it was the cause of it is to say that you were one of the leaders that had a total blind spot to this particular issue. Now, industries matter. There are some industries where we will have seen that this increased, places like healthcare, for example. There were intense amounts of burnout that was experienced. But let's be clear, even in healthcare, there were some massive struggles that come with kind of basic engagement. Even if you look at physician engagement, physicians were struggling even before the pandemic. So the pandemic did indeed make us discuss some of these issues, but let's be very clear that the pandemic did not cause them. These issues existed long before the pandemic.
That's exactly right. When I talk to teachers we're seeing tremendous amount of teachers leave the industry, and they'll call and they'll say they're burned out. And I dive in a little bit, and I think burnout's real. I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying, am I exhausted, meaning I've been going hard for a season, or have I lost the true flame? And I'm not trying to, parse words, but burnout to me is different than being tired. Tired is, I need to rejuvenate, but I'm ready to go, baby. I just need a little bit of rest, and I'm still fired up for the work. What I found from a lot of teachers is they still love teaching. They love instructing, but they can't do it in that environment anymore. And I think that's burnout in the sense of, I think that's exhaustion from their environment, and it's also burnout as well. But it's burnout that's driving the teacher to go, I don't want to do this in this environment, but if you get me out of that environment, here's what teachers are telling me. Oh, I'd love to still instruct on some level. So it's like it's diving into what's causing the burnout. And I think it's a lack of meaning and purpose. I think it's a toxic environment. It could be a whole host of things. I'm just curious what you think of that.
Well, let me just say broadly, yes, to everything that you just said. So we do mostly focus on burnout because the largest study that we've done on burnout, which actually predated the pandemic, is when you look at the actual drivers, I think there's a lot of confusion among leaders about what are the actual drivers of burnout. Because when you posit that question to them and say, what do you think it is? Most of the time they think it's exhaustion that's causing it. And they're correct. It is one of the top 5 things that causes burnout. But the single greatest contributor to burnout is perceived unfair treatment.
Yeah.
So this is a very key thing. And when you unpack perceived unfair treatment, there are a number of things. I mean, we see that there are massive issues around equity that still exist in the workplace. And it's not just issues of equity, or of pay. It's also issues around opportunities. Do people get the exact same opportunities internally? But the other massive one is this issue around who is carrying the workload. Because stars, if there's anything that drives them absolutely nuts, is when they think that there is another individual in the organization that does not carry their weight. And that frustration is something that they share with their colleagues and that they'll share with their manager. And if a manager isn't fully equipped to deal with a particular issue like that, it makes everyone incredibly disengaged. But I want to make one other comment. Because this distinction that you point out is really fascinating, because there's another element, which is, do people have the opportunity to do what they do best every single day? Because when somebody is in an environment where they are able to use their strengths, they actually gain energy from it.
Yes.
And although even if you do have the opportunity to use your strengths, yes, you may still feel exhausted. And everybody has a right to feel exhausted, especially if they're working hard. But when you are able to have the opportunity to do what you do best, you're actually doing what you do best, then you can actually go into what Csikszentmihalyi says is flow.
Yes.
You can work far more hours because these are things that just come completely naturally to you. So that's why I think it's so important for managers to individualize to the people that they work with on how do we set people up for success and give them the ability to do what they do best.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said it that way. That's beautiful, because that's the whole point. I can be really tired when I go home and I disengage from work, and I'm a husband and a dad and a dog dad and all the things. And I'm fired up the next morning because I'm coming in and I'm doing what I'm good at. I'm doing what I love, and I'm producing results that matter deeply to me. As I call that, the sweet spot. I mean, that's just where we're wired to be. And yet we just, leaders seem to miss this. And can I also just get your take on this? I'm so sick of hearing the old phrase, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. I just think it's absolutely a crock of crap, because I think you'll work harder. And to your point, you care deeper, which means you work harder, and then you're able to go at a higher pace. Can we just put that stupid saying to rest? It sounds wonderful, but I think it's misleading.
Thank you for bringing that up. So in Gallup's Global State of the Workplace that we launched earlier this year, that very issue is what I took issue with in the opening letter, which is I referred to it as a false workplace proverb.
Yeah.
Because saying to people, do what you love and you'll never work a day again in your life, is completely false. Even those people who are totally in flow, they're thriving at work, even they experience stress, even they sometimes even experience some pain. Because the very definition of work, which I think if you look it up in Webster's, is something along the lines of some sort of physical or mental resistance in order to accomplish something. You are going to feel some kind of strain or stress, but of course, in that particular context, that's when you grow as an individual. That's when you accomplish something as an individual. So take teachers, for example. Teaching a classroom, even if you're fully engaged, even if you're thriving at work, can be a difficult environment. If you have 20 to 25 young people, there are going to be tough days. So we can't live in this notion that you'll never work a day again in your life, because the very definition of work is to have this physical and sometimes mental strain in order to accomplish something.
Yeah. We talk a lot about talent in our circles, obviously. Gallup, the foremost leader on strengths. And then a lot of people in my space, influencers, like to poo-poo the word passion. They think it's fun and it's clickbaity, and they go, oh, don't follow your passion, which I agree. I think that is misguided if that's the only indicator. You got to have the talent to pull it off. But The root word for passion, which I use that word when I talk about work that you love, a task or a role that you look forward to. And when you get in it, man, time stands still and you get that energy because you're operating in that zone. But the root word for passion is to suffer. And I just find that most successful men and women, and we're talking about this idea, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life being a bunch of crap. This idea that when we do something we love, you think of a craftsman, Jon. I mean, they suffer. You suffer failure. You suffer rejection. You suffer patience. Hello. I mean, for entrepreneurs, patience is the hardest thing in the world. That is a form of suffering. But you do it because you love the work and you care about the outcome. We just tend to gloss over that a lot, don't we?
Maybe. Sometimes when I think of the word suffer, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who is doing some kind of excruciating work to achieve a particular outcome. Maybe. I mean,
I'm not saying that the work is excruciating. I'm saying like there's the idea of suffering. There's a passion, meaning that what you have to go through. And again, it may just be perseverance. It may be failure. It may be, right, I've got to go through arduous training to get where I want to go. My point is leaders overlook how much somebody loves something. And when you get them in that role that they love that work, they're going to have resilience. They're going to stick with it.
I do agree with that. I prefer the word struggle because I think when somebody is trying to figure out complex algorithms, if an engineer is trying to build something, they're struggling in order to figure out the outcome. And as I mentioned before, with that struggle comes growth. And so I do think that struggle can be a very positive thing.
Yeah.
I think what the point is, though, is that the misery in the workplace that many are currently experiencing is that we will never have an absence of struggle.
Right.
But the misery cannot be the soul of the job.
That's right.
And right now, for far too many, because of perceived unfair treatment of work, because of feeling totally ignored, because you have leaders who poorly communicate to many of those individuals, they are forced to suffer as opposed to struggle in a positive way to get the meaningful development and outcomes that are best for the workplace.
That's absolutely right. I think there's too much focus on procedural decisions and not relational. I think relational is going to give you the procedural. That's what I take away from this. I want to keep going. I've got to ask you, with remote work obviously being forced on us by the pandemic, now there's this slow return. You've got hybrid work, I think, is here to stay. You got some CEOs, Jamie Dimon, he's public. He's tracking people's key fobs. They're tracking people's keystrokes. I've reported on crazy stories where people are being spied on in remote work, all the things that's out there. And there's this tension right now between leaders and workers. How does a leader look at what you do and everything we've been discussing, relationship, happiness, well-being, how they need to be looking at those factors alongside of how we're going to work? Are we remote? Are we hybrid? Are we all back in? I'm just curious your take on how work is being shaped and what maybe the future might look like and the challenge for leaders.
For those who have remote capable work, and again, that's a big emphasis because as we look at the world's global workplace, many, of course, don't have that particular opportunity. But for those that do have hybrid ready work or available, the future of work for them is hybrid. And you can see very clearly in the data, the United States here with their time use survey, that those that are engaging in hybrid work, they're avoiding the thing that makes them most miserable in the day, which is the commute. In fact, if you ask workers, which we did, and said, what is it that you hate the most about your single day at work? They say it's the commute. It's about 40% of them say that's what I want to avoid the most. And in that time use survey that the US government did, is what they found is that people are making better use of that time. They're spending more time socializing, they're spending more time sleeping, working out, and on their hobbies. So it is an overall boost to their life. But even though makes their life better from those respects, there is a risk that it makes their work life worse.
Yes.
And here's the reason why. So we have been studying those that have been working remotely full time. And although their engagement is higher in absolute terms, over the past 2 years, they've seen the biggest decline in engagement. And the reason for that, and again, I consider engagement and work well-being to be the concepts that are identical. In fact, Danny Kahneman said something very similar on Adam Grant's podcast. And so the reason I think that their work well-being is in decline is because of a lack of communication. Microsoft did this one study, which I thought was really interesting, where they said those that are working remotely are engaging in far more asynchronous communication. And when we engage in more asynchronous communication, we start to understand each other far less. And that's a problem. And so if the future of work is going to be hybrid, leaders need to think far more critically about how do I engage in better, more synchronous dialogue with those that I'm working with? Because right now, the things that they're suffering from is feeling less recognized, feeling less like they have developmental opportunities, and feeling less like they know what's expected of them at work. All three things that have one thing in common: good communication. And so that's where leaders need to evolve as fast as possible if hybrid is going to be the future for those that are remote ready.
Yeah, that leads me to you talk about loneliness in this book. And I feel like that's a nice little transition here, because loneliness exists certainly when you're in a remote setting, but also in the hallways. Give us your thoughts on loneliness and then the leader's response to it.
I think that loneliness is one of the most underappreciated problems facing our world today.
I agree.
And the reason I say that is we went out and asked people, look at the past 2 weeks and tell us, how many people did you spend time with? Friends, family, anyone? And so in the responses, we had people say 150. I spent time with 90. I mean, they were very popular people that we engaged with. Sometimes people would say 7, but then there was a group of people who said 0.
Wow.
I didn't engage with anyone. In fact, that one engagement was our phone call or us knocking on the door and engaging in that dialogue with them. We find that 6% of all adults globally, or 300 million people around the planet, don't have a single friend that they talk to in their life.
Wow.
And it's no longer an exaggeration to say that loneliness kills. There is an academic at BYU, Julianne Luntz-Holt, where she did a meta-analysis on loneliness, and she found that those who suffer from debilitating loneliness have an increased risk of dying by 50%, 50% of anything. And the reason is not just that you don't have anyone to talk to. So if you're stressed out, you can kind of have a friend that'll be there for you to listen to. The other thing is you don't have anyone that's looking out for you. There was a study that was done, or excuse me, it wasn't a study, it was a real case. Police authorities in Italy were knocking on houses to warn people about high winds. And they kept knocking repeatedly on this woman's door, and nobody had heard from her. So they went into her house and they'd find that she had passed away. But that wasn't the worst part, is that she had been dead for 2 years and no one knew. But there are 300 million people on the planet that live just like her. And it's not just the amount of friends that we have, it's also the quality. So we ask people globally, if things go really bad in your life, do you have anyone there that would help you out? We find that 20% of adults everywhere say no to that particular question.
Oh my goodness.
And so there are some governments that are taking this very seriously. Japan twice has had ministries of loneliness. There is the Joe Cox Commission that's in the UK, where they too have started to, it's not technically a ministry of loneliness, but they're taking it that seriously, especially for the elderly population. So this is a big issue that not just public sector leaders should be more focused on, but also the private sector, because we know in studying workplaces everywhere that workplace relationships are a good thing. They're not just a good thing for productivity. They're not just a good thing for reducing turnover. They're also a good thing for reducing global loneliness. So private sector leaders have a massive role that they can play in this dialogue.
Yeah. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, John. You may have seen it, but there's been some recent news reports with some surveys. And again, I wish I could pull the exact number. I'm talking to the chief pollster of all time here. But we're seeing a rising number of people who don't want to socialize at all with their coworkers. I'm sure you've seen these reports. They're like, hey, I want to leave work at work. I don't want to hang out. I don't want to do any work activities, not work related, but just I don't want to hang out with my coworkers after hours, the happy hour, not interested. I don't want to talk to them at the office. I don't want to know about their kids. And we're seeing a rise in those numbers where they reject this idea. So that's obviously juxtaposed to what you just said and the value of workplace relationships. Is that rise a result of they're in a crappy environment, back to what we've kind of been talking about? And so that environment is so miserable that they don't want it. They want to leave it and leave it completely be.
One thing that leaders have to keep in mind in terms of there are so many with good hearts, and they say, you know what, we know this is something that private sector leaders can work on, so let's try to encourage friendships. And then they do something that's just not great, which is they force it. One of my favorite articles, this was by the columnist Bartleby in The Economist. I think it's right now a woman that wrote this particular piece, and she said one of the places where we can draw inspiration is the Beatles. Because the Beatles formed bonds with each other, not because they did axe throwing activities after work. It's because they jammed constantly and they loved what they did. And those bonds formed naturally. And so what they would do is not necessarily just write music together and play together. They would also play and get inspiration from other people's music. So they would just try out a song that somebody else had done. And that constant jamming, her words, is what caused them to have these very strong bonds. And that's one of the things that workplaces can draw an inspiration from, is to say, look, rather than force this, let's remember that we're all here for a common purpose. People join organizations for the brand and the mission that they're trying to accomplish. So let them happen naturally, and encourage them when they're doing it, but don't ever force it. And if there's those people that say, look, I don't want to have those workplace relationships. Don't add me on Facebook. Don't add me on Instagram. Fine. Let it happen. It's okay. Because forcing it just makes it completely awkward.
Yeah, I love it. John, this is really good research. It's also well written. Love the work that you do. I love that you're carrying the torch of a very, very valuable organization. I know that you got a lot going on and your time's valuable, but you've made us better, and I appreciate you for it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for having an ongoing interest in our work. We invest in a lot of this, and we believe that the more that we invest in this, we honestly believe that we can double the amount of people who are thriving at work, and it's amplifiers like yourself who help us reinforce this message. So thank you.
You bet. Hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jon Clifton, CEO of Gallup. The book is Blind Spot, The Global Rise of Unhappiness and How Leaders Missed It. Gallup.com is the website to learn more. And remember, if you're enjoying the show, like, subscribe, and share.